We've been very lucky. We hadn't had many illnesses in the family for a very long time. My grandparents lived to the high 90s.
Just after midnight, a sealed dossier changed hands inside the palace. By morning, Prince William had read what Camilla never expected to surface. It was not a rumor, not an interpretation, but evidence the palace could not explain away. Within hours, authority shifted, access vanished, and protections quietly collapsed. This was not a family disagreement. It was a reckoning triggered by what had been hidden too long: the wrong hands. The first sign that something had gone wrong was not a call or a message. Shortly after midnight, a routine exchange inside the palace failed to occur. A document that should have been logged, routed, and acknowledged remained unaccounted for. No alert was triggered. No protocol was activated. The silence passed unnoticed precisely because silence had long been trusted as a source of stability. That trust was misplaced. The material did not enter the palace through official channels. It bypassed reception points, avoided digital tracking, and arrived in physical form, sealed and unmarked except for a narrow internal code that meant little to anyone outside a specific circle. Whoever carried it understood how the palace functioned. More importantly, they understood how it failed. The choice of delivery method was deliberate. This was not information meant to circulate. It was information meant to land. The person who accepted the folder did not open it. They did not read it. They did not ask questions. Their instructions were clear and unsettling in their simplicity. This must be handed directly to Prince William. No copies, no intermediaries, no record of transfer. By the time the folder reached William's private office, the palace was still asleep. Corridors were quiet. Staff movement was minimal. The moment was chosen carefully, not for drama, but for insulation. Fewer witnesses meant fewer variables. Fewer variables meant fewer chances for intervention. William did not expect the delivery. That fact alone marked it as significant. He acknowledged receipt without comment and instructed that no one be informed of the material's arrival. This was not secrecy as instinct. It was caution as necessity. The palace had been shaped by decades of controlled disclosure, and William understood that premature circulation would not clarify the situation. It would distort it. The folder remained closed for several minutes, not out of hesitation but assessment. The weight of what it might contain was already evident in how it had been delivered. Documents that required such care rarely resolved quietly. When William finally opened it, the structure of the contents was immediately striking. There were no annotations, no cover letters, no framing language. The evidence spoke for itself, assembled with a precision that suggested time, patience, and access. Each page introduced a fragment of a larger pattern, correspondence aligned with decisions, decisions aligned with outcomes, outcomes traced back to access that had never been formally granted but consistently exercised. The connective tissue between these elements was not dramatic, it was procedural. That made it more dangerous. This was not the kind of evidence that could be dismissed as interpretation or rivalry. It was the kind that forced recognition. What unsettled William most was not any single item, but the coherence of the whole. The documents did not rely on implication. They relied on sequence. Once that sequence was visible, it became impossible to unsee. As he moved through the material, one name surfaced repeatedly, not always directly but persistently. Queen Camilla was not accused of overt misconduct. The evidence did something far more destabilizing. It suggested influence operating without boundary, shaping outcomes through proximity rather than authority. Influence of that kind is difficult to regulate because it rarely leaves fingerprints. Here, however, the fingerprints had accumulated over time. William paused more than once, not to reread, but to recalibrate. This was not a matter that could be absorbed into existing frameworks. It did not fit neatly into precedent or protocol. The palace was adept at managing external pressure. Internal distortion was another matter entirely. The most troubling aspect was how long the pattern appeared to have gone unchallenged. The evidence suggested normalization rather than concealment. Behaviors that should have triggered a review had been accepted as routine. That acceptance now reads as vulnerability. William closed the folder without signaling a reaction. Outside the room, the palace continued its quiet rhythm. Staff are prepared for the day. Schedules were finalized. No one knew that the internal balance had already been disturbed. He did not summon advisors. He did not request a legal assessment. Doing so would expand the circle of awareness before he understood the full scope of the risk. For now, containment required solitude. Instead, he began asking questions that appeared unrelated. A schedule adjustment here, a clarification request there. Each inquiry was small enough to avoid notice, but targeted enough to test assumptions. The responses came back quickly and consistently. They aligned with the material in the folder. At no point did William consider confronting Camilla directly. Confrontation presumes symmetry. This situation was asymmetrical by design. The evidence had been leaked precisely because conventional channels were assumed to be compromised. What mattered now was not reaction, but exposure. Who else knew? Who else might know? And how far the implications extended beyond what he had already seen. The palace, unaware of the danger moving through its internal systems, continued to rely on habits that had protected it in the past. Access remained fluid. Assumptions remained unchallenged. The evidence in William's possession suggested those assumptions could no longer be trusted. As the morning approached, the weight of the folder did not lessen. It intensified, not because of what it proved, but because of what it threatened to unravel. The leak had not detonated anything yet. It had simply arrived. And inside the palace, arrival was often the most dangerous phase of all. What William understood as the first light reached the windows of his office was that the evidence had been placed exactly where it would do the most damage if mishandled. The question now was not what it revealed, but rather it was even darker: the evidence about the Queen. Prince William did not move immediately to judgment. That restraint was deliberate. The material in front of him demanded patience, not reaction. Evidence of this nature did not announce its full significance at once. It required careful reading, not for what it accused, but for what it exposed about how the palace had been functioning without realizing it. What emerged most clearly was not a scandal in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic transgressions, no singular act that could be isolated and condemned. Instead, the evidence mapped influence. Quiet, persistent, and unrecorded influence that flowed through informal access rather than official authority. Queen Camilla appeared throughout the documentation not as a central figure issuing directives, but as a constant presence at pivotal moments. Meetings were adjusted around her availability. Decisions softened after private conversations. Appointments shifted following informal consultations that left no trace in official minutes. The monarchy had long operated on a delicate balance between formal structure and personal proximity. Consorts traditionally exercised influence through trust rather than mandate. What the evidence suggested, however, was that this influence had crossed from advisory into operational territory without oversight or acknowledgement. William read slowly, marking nothing, reacting outwardly to nothing. Each page reinforced the same underlying issue. Boundaries that existed on paper had eroded in practice. Over time, that erosion had become invisible to those working within it. The most troubling documents were not the most dramatic. They were the most ordinary. Routine correspondence that had been rerouted. Invitations extended or withheld without a recorded rationale. Advisory notes altered after informal review. None of these actions alone would have raised concern. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. What made the pattern especially dangerous was its subtlety. There was no clear point at which intervention should have occurred. No moment of obvious overreach. The system had adjusted incrementally, accommodating influence until influence became expectation. This was not misconduct that could be addressed through reprimand or clarification. It was a distortion embedded in the process. William understood immediately why this material had been leaked rather than raised internally. Any attempt to surface these concerns through existing channels would have been absorbed, contextualized, and ultimately neutralized. The influence documented was the same as the one that would have shaped the response. That realization reframed the entire situation. The evidence did not challenge Camilla's loyalty or intent. It challenged the palace's capacity to regulate proximity. It revealed a structural vulnerability that placed too much weight on trust without sufficient counterbalance from accountability. As William continued, another layer became apparent. Some of the decisions influenced through these informal channels intersected with sensitive institutional matters, not in overtly improper ways, but in ways that blurred responsibility. Institutions survive on clarity of responsibility. The evidence suggested that this clarity had been quietly compromised over time, without malicious intent, but with greater effect. Prince William paused frequently to consider implications. If this pattern became public, the narrative would not focus on nuance. It would collapse into accusation. William also recognized that the documents did not represent the full extent of the issue. They represented what could be documented, and that understanding increased the urgency without resolving the path forward. He considered consultation, as King Charles would need to know. But timing mattered, and he knows that presenting this material prematurely could trigger defensive alignment rather than assessment. Princess Anne came to mind as well, and her reputation for institutional clarity was unmatched. Yet even involving her too early risked widening the circle before William had determined the scope. The most unsettling realization came as he reviewed the final sections. The evidence suggested that safeguards designed to prevent exactly this kind of informal consolidation had been bypassed, not through defiance but familiarity. People trusted proximity more than process. William understood that confronting Camilla directly would accomplish little at this stage, and removal, even temporary, would signal changes that would raise more questions. As the palace moved through the morning, William felt the pressure of time tighten. The evidence had not yet escaped his control, but it exerted force simply by existing. He also understood that any action he took would be interpreted as personal unless grounded in institutional necessity. By late morning, the weight of the situation had shifted as the evidence no longer felt like information. William knew then that the next phase could not involve exposure. It would involve quiet, careful, and easily misread calibration. The evidence had revealed more than influence. It had revealed fragility. As he closed the folder again, the question pressing forward was no longer whether something would change. It was how much could change before anyone realized it was happening, and whether the palace would recognize the shift as a correction or as a threat when it finally became visible. William's quiet seizure of control. Prince William did not announce his response to the evidence. In fact, he did not acknowledge it outwardly at all. That silence was intentional. Power, when exercised quietly, travels further before it is resisted. The first shifts were so minor they appeared administrative. What made these moves effective was their invisibility, as William did not challenge Camilla directly. Instead, he began questioning the structures that allowed such influence to operate without a record. Within hours, palace aides noticed that decisions once assumed were now being confirmed. Requests that previously passed through informal channels were being redirected to formal ones. This was not an obstruction. It was now a procedure reasserting itself. Prince William framed his actions as precautionary rather than corrective, and the effect was immediate but subtle. Formal processes introduce friction, and that friction slowed down momentum without naming its source. Camilla's office felt the change before Camilla herself did, as William was careful not to isolate her completely. That would have signaled intent too early. Instead, he allowed normal interactions to continue while quietly narrowing their scope. The goal was not confrontation, it was containment. At the same time, William began consolidating information. He requested briefings that had previously been optional. He asked for documentation that had long been treated as an informal record. Each request was framed as a routine review, as none of them referenced the leaked evidence directly. This approach served two purposes. It expanded his understanding of the institutional terrain while signaling a shift toward formal accountability. Those accustomed to operating on trust alone began adjusting their behavior instinctively, unsure of the new expectations, but aware that something had changed. King Charles remained deliberately outside this phase, as William had not yet involved him. Not because of secrecy, but because premature consultation would complicate execution. The palace operates on layers of deference, many of them unspoken. William understood those layers as he did not challenge them head-on. He repositioned himself within them, occupying spaces where assumptions had previously sufficed. Staff responded quickly, though not uniformly. Some welcomed the clarity. Others hesitated, sensing disruption but unsure of its source. A few attempted to restore familiar pathways, only to encounter unexpected resistance from procedures that now required confirmation. The resistance did not come directly from William. It came from systems he had quietly reactivated. What made this moment uncertain was how easily it could be misinterpreted. To those outside the inner workings, nothing appeared to be happening. To those inside, the ground was shifting without explanation. That uncertainty bred caution. Camilla became aware of the changes gradually. At first, they were seen as an inconvenience rather than as a source of exclusion. A delayed response here, a rescheduled engagement there, nothing dramatic, nothing overt, but the pattern grew harder to ignore. Those closest to her began asking questions such as why approvals now require additional review, why informal assurances are no longer held. William understood that once the shift became visible enough to name, resistance would follow. The palace is indeed skilled at defending personalities, but it is less experienced at defending processes that have already been replaced. As the day progressed, William's role expanded quietly as he was consulted on matters that previously would not have reached him. He did not request this new role. It occurred naturally as staff sought clarity in a changing environment. And just like that, William became that anchor. He remained careful not to overextend. Each intervention was narrowly justified, as each decision was framed as a temporary alignment pending review. The most delicate part of this phase involved access. Who could speak privately with whom? Which conversations occurred without a record? William did not restrict access outright. He introduced presence. Meetings once held on one now include an additional observer. Notes were taken where none had been before. By early afternoon, the palace had begun adapting to a new rhythm. The pace slowed, decisions accumulated. The sense of ease that had characterized informal authority dissipated, replaced by procedural awareness. Still, nothing had been explained. That silence was both a shield and a weapon. William knew that this phase could not last indefinitely. Eventually, the changes would demand justification. Camilla would notice fully. Others would conclude. But for now, the advantage lay in ambiguity. The evidence had not yet been shared. The confrontation had not yet occurred. What was happening was quieter and more dangerous. Control was being reasserted without announcement, and once control begins to shift in silence, it is very difficult to restore without exposing the reason for its shift in the first place. As the palace settled into this altered pattern, one question lingered beneath every interaction. How long could this recalibration continue before someone forced the issue into the open? The stripping of Camilla's status. At first, it was subtle enough to be mistaken for a coincidence, a briefing that no longer appeared on a calendar, a call that went unanswered longer than usual. An invitation was redirected through a different office without explanation. In an institution built on habit, even small deviations carry meaning. Queen Camilla noticed the pattern before anyone acknowledged it aloud. The palace had always functioned through proximity, and access mattered more than title. Influence flowed through rooms rather than memos. So what unsettled her now was not a single denial, but a cumulative narrowing of space. Meetings that once assumed her presence were confirmed later, then not at all. Background papers that typically arrived early were delayed or summarized by intermediaries. Decisions she had once shaped through conversation were now presented as settled outcomes. This was not entirely punishment at first glance. The palace did not issue any instructions removing authority. Instead, it removed pathways through which more authority had been exercised. That distinction mattered, as authority stripped publicly invites defense. Authority eroded procedurally dissolves before resistance can organize. Prince William never framed the recalibration as a response to any individual. In internal exchanges, he spoke of alignment, audit integrity, and record clarity. These were terms that sounded technical, even benign. They also justified structural change without naming its target. The result was immediate friction. Informal decisions slowed, verbal assurances lost weight. Processes once accelerated by trust now require confirmation. Each step appeared reasonable. Collectively, they transformed how power moved through the palace. Camilla's staff felt the shift acutely. Requests were returned with questions that had never been asked before. Approvals were routed through offices that previously deferred. Conversations that once resolved issues now ended with references to procedure. No one accused, no one explained. When inquiries were made, the answers were consistent and evasive in equal measure. There had been no directive, no change in role, only a renewed emphasis on structure. That emphasis was impossible to argue against without appearing resistant to accountability. King Charles remained formally detached from this phase. His silence was conspicuous, and it amplified the effect. In the palace, the absence of intervention often signals consent. Those watching closely began to understand that what was unfolding carried tacit approval, even without explicit endorsement. Camilla attempted to restore equilibrium through familiar means. A private conversation here, a gentle inquiry there. The responses were polite, deferential, and unyielding. Everyone acknowledged her position. No one altered course. What made the moment destabilizing was the lack of a single point of confrontation. There was no meeting to attend, no decision to contest. The changes were dispersed across departments, each justified independently, yet aligned in outcome. The stripping of status was not symbolic, it was functional. Access to sensitive briefings was narrowed. Invitations to participate in preparatory discussions ceased. Representation in external coordination was reassigned quietly. These were not public roles, but they were the mechanisms through which influence had been exercised. Their removal was surgical. Staff adjusted quickly. Institutions always do. Those who had relied on informal cues recalibrated their behavior. The palace began to feel different, not colder, but more deliberate, less reliant on personality, more reliant on paper. Princess Anne observed the shift without comment. Her familiarity with institutional correction allowed her to recognize the pattern. She understood that this was not an attempt to humiliate. It was an attempt to stabilize by removing ambiguity. The palace had chosen structure over sentiment. Camilla, however, experienced the change as disorientation. Years of proximity had created a rhythm that now felt disrupted. She was still present, still acknowledged, still respected. Yet the center of gravity had moved. The absence of an announcement made the process more difficult to confront. There was nothing to refute, nothing to appeal. Every inquiry returned to the same point. The procedure had been clarified, boundaries reinforced, records prioritized. This was not reversible through charm or reassurance. By the time Camilla fully recognized the extent of the shift, it had already normalized. Staff spoke in new patterns. Decisions followed new routes. The old pathways no longer existed to be reclaimed. The palace had adapted to the change without pausing to name it. Externally, nothing appeared altered. Appearances continued. Protocols were observed. The public saw continuity. Inside, however, the balance of influence had been redrawn. What was most unsettling was the realization that status had been stripped without a moment to resist. There had been no warning because a warning would have invited negotiation. Negotiation would have delayed correction. Delay was no longer an option. William understood the risk of this approach. Silent recalibration breeds suspicion if discovered, but it also prevents the consolidation of opposition. By the time the change is recognized, it is already embedded. The palace now operated under a new assumption. Authority required traceability, influence required record, proximity alone no longer sufficed. Camilla's role, once fluid and expansive, had been narrowed to its formal definition. Everything else had been removed not by decree, but by design. What remained was uncertainty. Uncertainty about how much had been lost. Uncertainty about whether the change was temporary or permanent. Uncertainty about who knew the full reason and who was merely adapting instinctively. That uncertainty was the final element of the stripping. As the palace settled into this altered state, the silence surrounding the change grew heavier. Silence in this context was not neutrality. It was confirmation that the recalibration was intentional. Palace shockwaves and family fallout. The shock did not arrive all at once. It moved unevenly through the palace, registering first as confusion, then as unease, and finally as recognition. By the time senior figures fully understood what had changed, the change itself had already taken hold. Inside the royal household, awareness spread through omission rather than announcement. Conversations that once included Camilla no longer did. Briefings she had previously shaped arrived finalized. Decisions appeared complete before discussion could begin. No one explained why. No one needed to. For those who had spent years navigating the palace by instinct rather than instruction, the adjustment was disorienting. Informal hierarchies collapsed quietly. People who once relied on proximity recalibrated toward procedure. The palace did not resist this shift, it absorbed it. Family members felt the change in subtler ways. King Charles remained publicly steady, but privately unsettled. Not because he questioned the necessity of what was happening, but because of how it was unfolding. The palace had always managed family conflict through mediation and delay. This was different. Authority was being exercised without negotiation, and its speed left little room for sentiment. Those close to the king described a tension between paternal instinct and institutional realism. Camilla was his wife, but the crown was his obligation. What troubled him was not the erosion of her influence, but the realization that the erosion had already occurred before he was asked to respond to it. That realization carried its own weight. Princess Anne responded with characteristic restraint. She did not question the recalibration, she evaluated it. From her perspective, the palace was correcting an imbalance that should never have developed. Influence without record had always carried risk. The evidence that prompted this correction only made that risk visible. Anne's concern lay elsewhere. She worried about precedent. Once authority shifts without explanation, trust becomes fragile. Institutions survive on clarity, even when that clarity is uncomfortable. Silence, while effective, creates its own vulnerabilities. Prince William understood that risk intimately. He had accepted it when he chose this path. The fallout he now observed was not unintended. It was anticipated. Shock was the price of speed. Speed was the price of containment. Still, the emotional consequences were harder to predict. Camilla's isolation became more apparent as days passed. Not dramatic, not public, but unmistakable. Invitations narrowed, conversations shortened. Her presence no longer altered outcomes. Those around her adjusted their behavior carefully, uncertain how to respond without guidance. This uncertainty was not cruel, it was caution. Within the family, reactions varied. Some viewed the shift as overdue, others saw it as destabilizing. A few questioned whether the method risked deepening division. No one disputed that something had gone wrong. What remained unclear was how much damage would result from how it was being addressed. The absence of a family meeting amplified tension. Traditionally, moments of internal correction were accompanied by private reckoning. This time, there was none. The lack of confrontation denied closure. It also denied resistance. Camilla did not protest publicly or privately. Those who expected denial or outrage were surprised by her composure. She recognized the pattern quickly. Influence that disappears without announcement does so because confrontation would confirm what silence conceals. Her response was withdrawal rather than challenge. She reduced her engagements. She spoke less. She listened more. This was not a concession, it was a recalculation. That recalculation unsettled those who assumed the shift would provoke immediate conflict. Instead, it produced something quieter and more dangerous, uncertainty layered with restraint. Staff felt the tension acutely. Loyalty became complicated. Some had built their roles around Camilla's access. Others had relied on her mediation to navigate palace complexities. Now, those buffers were gone. People recalibrated their alliances not out of ambition but survival. The palace entered a period of internal vigilance. Conversations became careful. Language tightened. Even casual remarks were weighed. Everyone sensed that scrutiny had intensified, even if they could not name its source. What disturbed many was how little information circulated about the reason behind the shift. Rumors filled the vacuum, but none aligned perfectly. Some suspected evidence, others assumed strategic repositioning. A few wondered whether this was preparation for something yet to come. Prince William neither confirmed nor denied any of it. That silence protected him, but it also isolated him. Authority exercised quietly attracts attention once its effects become visible. He felt the weight of expectation increase with every unasked question. Yet he did not retreat. He understood that family fallout was unavoidable. What mattered was whether the institution could absorb it without fracturing. The palace had survived open conflict before. It was less prepared for quiet redefinition. King Charles eventually addressed the situation privately, not with Camilla, but with those tasked with keeping the household functional. His instruction was simple: maintain dignity, avoid escalation, allow the process to complete itself. That instruction was interpreted as acceptance. Camilla's relationship with Charles adjusted accordingly, less visible, more formal, still intact but altered. The balance between personal partnership and institutional priority shifted subtly but permanently. No one celebrated this outcome. It was not a victory, it was a cost. The palace now operated under a new internal awareness. Power could shift without announcement. Influence could be removed without confrontation. Evidence, once introduced, could reshape the institution before anyone realized a battle had begun. Family bonds strained under that awareness. Not broken, not severed, but tested in ways they had not been before. As days passed, one truth became unavoidable. The fallout was no longer confined to Camilla alone. It had exposed fault lines that extended across the entire royal structure. The monarchy going forward. The palace did not rush to restore balance because balance itself had been redefined. What Prince William set in motion was not a temporary correction, but a demonstration of how authority would function when confronted with internal distortion. The evidence had forced a choice, and the choice had reshaped the rules without announcing them. For the monarchy, the implications extended far beyond Camilla. The most immediate shift was philosophical. Influence would no longer be assumed safe simply because it was familiar. Proximity would no longer substitute for process. The palace, long reliant on custom and trust, had been compelled to acknowledge that informal power posed a risk equal to any external threat. That acknowledgement altered everything, as Prince William did not frame his actions as reform. He did not speak of modernization or correction. He allowed the institution to draw its own conclusions from the changes already in effect. That restraint was strategic. Reform invites debate. Reality invites adaptation. Those closest to him understood that this moment marked a transition in leadership style. William was not waiting for accession to assert authority. He was exercising it where institutional survival demanded clarity. The message was unmistakable. Future leadership would prioritize traceability over tradition. This recalibration unsettled some and reassured others. For senior aides, the change introduced certainty even if it arrived abruptly. Decision-making now requires documentation. Influence required accountability. Conversations that once resolved matters quietly now leave records. The palace felt less fluid but more defensible. For others, particularly those who had thrived within informal networks, the adjustment was jarring. Their influence diminished not because of wrongdoing, but because the system no longer accommodated ambiguity. The rules had changed without ceremony. King Charles faced his own reckoning in this shift. His reign, already defined by gradual transition, now bore the imprint of decisive internal correction. Though he had not publicly endorsed William's actions, his refusal to reverse them carried meaning. Silence in this context was confirmation. Charles understood that intervening would not restore harmony. It would reopen instability. The palace had moved forward, and leadership now required acceptance of that movement rather than resistance to it. Queen Camilla remained outwardly dignified, but her position had been irrevocably altered. What had been stripped was not title or presence, but the quiet authority that came from unrestricted access. That authority does not return easily, if at all. The monarchy had demonstrated that even the most entrenched influence could be recalibrated without spectacle. That demonstration would not be forgotten. Princess Anne viewed the outcome with measured approval. From her perspective, the institution had finally enforced a boundary it had long acknowledged but never formalized. The cost was high, but the clarity was necessary. What mattered now was consistency. The precedent set by this moment will shape how future crises are handled. Internal evidence will not be deferred for harmony. Informal power will not be shielded by familiarity. Silence will be used strategically, not reflexively. The palace will move forward more cautiously, more structured, and less tolerant of ambiguity. That evolution carries risk. It reduces flexibility, it strains relationships, but it also strengthens institutional coherence. For the public, much of this will remain invisible. Appearances will continue. Traditions will be observed, continuity will be projected. Yet beneath that surface, the monarchy has shifted from assumption to assertion. Evidence, once introduced, immediately changes the balance of power. Authority does not require an announcement to be exercised, and silence, when paired with action, speaks louder than explanation. Prince William did not strip Camilla of everything in a single moment. He demonstrated that everything rests on structure, not sentiment. That demonstration will echo through future decisions long after the specifics fade. The monarchy now exists in a space shaped by that reality. It will endure, but it will endure differently. Because once the palace proves it can recalibrate itself without permission, without announcement, and without reversal, it cannot return to the comfort of old assumptions. The crown moves forward not with certainty, but with intent. And in that intent lies a future where authority is no longer inherited quietly. It is exercised deliberately.